So today on this episode of The Harbor, we have Ross Szabo, who is an author, you're a speaker, you're a trainer, you're also the wellness director at Geffen Academy, and you specialize and focus a lot on mental health and mental wellness. And so for most of us, we hear the term mental health and our mind instantly goes to this certain place. And so why'd you choose mental health? Like, why is that the direction you chose to go in?
Well, I think a lot of people don't become mental health advocates because they had like this perfect life and they're like one day like,
Right.
man, I should tell everybody how perfect my life was.
Right.
I love it. I did go through my own personal experiences. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 16. When I was 17, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. And when that happened, I wasn't on anyone's radar. I was like president of my class and a varsity basketball player and involved in all kinds of organizations and volunteering. But I went through a really massive bout of depression. After I got out of the hospital, I eventually graduated from high school, went to college. 2 months into my freshman year, had a major relapse with bipolar disorder, had to go home. And then I was in and out of hospitals and colleges for the next kind of 4 years battling bipolar disorder and extreme substance abuse before I really found a way to start managing it.
Wow.
But the reason I started speaking about it is after I got out of the hospital when I was a senior in high school, the school really just didn't understand mental health. And so everybody had like a lot of rumors about me and they were making fun of me and laughing at me. And 2 months after I got out of the hospital, a psychologist came into one of my classrooms to talk about the patients he treated. And as he talked about the patients he treated, every single kid in the classroom was laughing. And at that point, I'd just been laughed at too much. And so I took my teacher into the hallway and I said, hey, this isn't funny to me. And he asked me, like, well, what are you going to do about it?
Wow.
And I said, let me speak. Let me tell people what it's like to actually go through this.
Right.
So I started speaking about this while I was still in high school.
Still in high school. And so you were, on the outside, you look like the typical high school kid, right? Like normal athlete, president of your class. But on the inside, you were having obviously like a huge battle in your head. And so had you learned anything in high school to help you? Or was it just kind of like what your parents had taught you, what you'd seen from friends, like teachers? Like, had you learned anything to help?
I think what's tough is like in school, I had a psychology class my senior year that talked about the disorders.
Right.
But nobody really talked to you about kind of the skills outside of it. And what was funny, what really bothered me was when everybody laughed at this psychologist telling these stories is like, my friends were drinking as much as I was.
Right.
Like there were a lot of people that were as dysfunctional as I was. There just wasn't a name for them. So they weren't like stigmatized. They weren't treated differently. But because I had like an actual diagnosis, I was a weirdo.
Right.
And that's what really bothered me. I was like, you're all doing something.
Totally.
Mine might be a little bit more severe, but like, we all need to try and work on this stuff.
Absolutely. And so the conversation has grown around mental health. And there's a lot of awareness today. And there's a lot of PSAs and a lot of campaigns. And there's a lot of like, hey, talk about mental health. Go seek help. Go get help. And so you really want to kind of change the conversation. And like that's one of your big focuses is like starting the conversation and changing the way that we maybe bring it up in class or we even define mental health. And so how do you define mental health?
Well, you just said a lot. So I think there's two things happening. One, the awareness is much more in the past 15 years than it ever has been. And so a lot of students are hearing terms like mental health and anxiety and depression, but they still don't know what it means. And so for me, it's really important to go past awareness and start teaching skills. We do that with physical health. We wouldn't just go out and tell everybody that they have physical health problems and then be like, well, you should seek help. We teach them what to do. So teaching students what to do has to start with a clear definition. And like you said, when most people hear the words mental health, they immediately think something's wrong with them. They think depression and schizophrenia and suicidal thoughts, and they think that there's something that they need to fix or work on. But the actual definition of mental health is how you take care of your emotions and how you address challenges in your life and how you deal with everything you're facing. Mental health definition isn't like just something you do when something's wrong.
Right.
It's something that you build and you foster and you grow. And so I think it's really healthy to start with a clear definition of what mental health actually is. It's not something you do just when something's wrong. It's something as important as your physical health. You exercise, you eat right, you try to take care of your body. With your mental health, it's more about communicating. It's about relationships. It's about coping skills and how you take care of your mind. So even a student who doesn't necessarily have like a diagnosis or a clear thing wrong with them doesn't mean that they can't work on their mental health. They can find ways to communicate with their parents, with their friends, with other people about anything they're experiencing, even if it's just dating, even if it's just being stressed out.
Right.
And then the other side of it too is paying attention to like, how do they cope? You know, do they cope by binge eating junk food? Do they cope by going for a run? Do they cope by, you know, just zoning out and playing video games for 14 hours a day?
Right.
And because those coping skills are what are going to stick, and those coping skills are what's going to grow.
For a lot of people watching, a lot of kids watching this, if you know, they don't think something's wrong or they haven't had that big life moment yet, it's still the habits we create are everything. And it's so much easier to start habits when you're young. From, you know, you talk a lot about sports and like identity and like the habits that they have and how it transitions into mental health. So talk a little bit about just like the identity and the habitual thing that goes on in your brain.
So in the teenage years, that's when you're forming your identity. Everybody is. And for student athletes, when they're forming their identity, that identity sticks a lot longer. So somebody who starts playing a sport and gets recognized for it and is really good at it at a young age, that becomes who they are. So whether it's snowboarding or skateboarding or basketball or football, they start doing it so well, they get recognized for it. They get so good that they get noticed at the local mall or like all these other places, right? And if you're really good, you get into college sports or professional sports as a teenager. When that sport ends for you, whether it's in your 30s or in your age 21 because you blow out your knee or whatever it is, it's really hard to make that transition because your identity has been this one thing. And if you don't work on your mental health, and if you don't have other interests, and if you don't have something else that gives you purpose, well, now everything's gone. And this is well documented. I mean, even people like Shaquille O'Neal talk about the day after basketball ended for him, he went into a really deep state of depression. And when TNT called to like give him a announcing job, he was excited because it gave him something to do again.
Right.
So that identity element isn't just present in student athletes, but it is much harder to deal with for student athletes because I think it's also reinforced by the public. It's reinforced in so many other ways. And when it ends,
it's tough.
It's really hard.
Well, most of us introduce ourselves as what we do, right? Like I'm this, I skate, or I play basketball, or I sing, or this is my job. And so a lot of us like to identify ourselves as a thing that we do. And so it's tough when that thing's ripped out from underneath us. And so what, if you're a teacher watching this right now and you want to start this conversation about mental health in its totality, not just like the bad side of it, what are some practical things a teacher or a school can start doing in the classroom today to start this conversation around mental health and mental wellness?
I think one of the easiest things to do is just break your classroom into small groups and ask them all the words, ideas, songs, movies, books, concepts, celebrities, scenarios they think of when they hear the words mental health. So just that. Just break into small groups, give them pieces of paper, and have them write down what are all the things you think of when you hear the words mental health. And they'll write down, celebrity breakdowns and all different kinds of movies and books and songs and other people. And then after they do that, ask the groups to count up how many of those words have a positive connotation, how many have a negative connotation, and how many have a neutral connotation. And then discuss as a group why they had more of one than the other. So a majority of the groups will have more negative than others. Most of the times when we do this, it's like we had 26 negative terms and nothing else.
Right.
And so when they have that conversation about why they think of mental health that way, instead of telling them what mental health is, you're actually engaging them in the process where they're thinking about why they think about it that way. And then when you give the accurate definition of mental health, which is not having a problem, but how you address challenges in your lives, now you're bringing them into that creative process instead of just telling them what it is. And it works. It's a much better exercise.
So if a kid's watching this and they're struggling with coping, they're struggling with talking to someone, what advice would you have for that young person?
Step A is really knowing why you don't want to seek help or why you don't want to talk about it. So like I had access to the best mental health treatment in the world, but I wasn't compliant with it and I didn't care about it because I felt stupid. I felt embarrassed, I felt ashamed, I felt weak, and I really just wanted the problems to go away. I didn't want to work on them. And so I kept going to my psychologist and going to my psychiatrist, and I just wasn't honest. And I wasn't actually trying to get better because I felt these other things. So if you're in my situation where you're struggling, you're going through a lot of stuff, you have to start with how you feel about seeking help. Do you feel weak? Do you feel embarrassed? Do you feel ashamed? And what can you do to work past that? Eventually, I learned that seeking help took a lot of strength. And it took a lot more strength to talk about what I was going through than it did to hide it. And then it did to bury it. Or then it did to like drink it away and escape. Mm-hmm. And so that has to be step A. What are the biggest reasons you don't want to seek help? Or what are the biggest reasons you don't want to talk about this? And then how can you break those things down?
I think we all know that the toughest critic is the one between our own ears. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all know that, and we have all experienced that. And so what's a trick or a tip to like changing that conversation in your head so you're not the reason? Most of us don't seek help because we're scared of what other people will think.
Right.
So how do we flip the script in our head so that's the person urging us to get help or urging us to get better? Because ultimately, that's who wins in the end.
I think one of the best analogies for that is to treat it like physical health. You know, some of us, probably you included, might limp around for a couple of weeks and be like, well, I'm not sure if my foot's broken, but I don't want to find out.
Right.
But eventually you get to the point where you're like, oh man, I got to find out what's going on.
Totally.
Here. With our emotions, what a lot of us do is that same equivalent. Mm-hmm. We're limping around, hoping that it's not something severe, hoping that it's not something bad. But the only person who can really tell you if your foot's broken is a doctor who x-rays it.
Right.
And the only person who can really change what you're going through, if your emotions, is a professional who can tell you, okay, hey, look, this isn't as bad as you think it is. Mm-hmm. But you got to express it so that it doesn't get worse. Or someone who's like, hey, you know what, this is actually a diagnosis. And we can help you with it, and here's what you can do. But I think that's the best mechanism, is to look at your brain as a part of your body. Mm. You might limp around for a couple of weeks and not go to seek help, but eventually it grows to a point where it's unavoidable.
Totally.
What we do with our emotions is we hide them for so long until they start coming out sideways.
Absolutely.
And that's how you take care of yourself.
Awesome, man. Ross, thanks so much for your time, man. I appreciate your insight, your input. If anybody wants to check out your book or kind of look up more about you, what's your company called? What's your book called? Where can they find some of this information?
Sure. The book's called Behind Happy Faces.
Okay.
You can buy it on Amazon.
Awesome.
And then my company's website is humanpowerproject.com. That's where curriculum I developed is available.
Awesome. So book is again called Behind Happy Faces, and Human Power Connection.
Human Power Project.
Humanpowerproject.com.
Yeah.
Awesome. Ross, thanks so much for your time today, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.